Listen up, folks. As you come up, there are 3 handouts. I'm using the ancient technology of the handout. And I will tell you why in a moment. Okay, if you don't have a handout, you need to get one in the next 20 minutes, actually. It'll be a while. Okay, so I'm talking about Richard Allen, who is the founder of the AME Church and the first bishop thereof. You may wonder how I got into this business. It's totally different from anything I've ever done before. But a few years ago, about 2017, the Institute of Sacred Music got together with the Divinity School and the Duke School of Theology to do a project in coitus at first. We didn't really know what was going to happen, but I was asked to join. And there were people from the UK, from Duke, from Yale. And so we just started getting together and talking and deciding what to do. It was led by a theologian, a British theologian named Jeremy Begbie, who is a much published writer. He has this obsession with music and theology and singing and how all of these things go together. And so this was basically his baby. And we met, and actually some good things came out of it. And we finally decided he wanted to talk about a certain period, like 1750 to 1850. We ended up doing like 1740 to 1850, I think it was. What came out of it was this book, the title of which is Theology, Music, and Modernity, Struggles for Freedom. So obviously the subject is theology and music, especially freedom, which we'll talk about a lot. And there are 4 sections to the book. The first one is called Revolutionary Freedom, the second one called From Church to Concert Hall, the third, Singing Justice, and the fourth, Music, Freedom, and Language. So it's a very academic book, especially parts 1, 2, and 4. I was involved in part 3. And what part 3 is about is this. They were talking in very, very high philosophical and theological terms about freedom and modernity. And so modernity, I should caution you about that. Most of us think, and this was including me not that long ago, when I think of modern and modernity, I think of, the year 1900 and Picasso and Braque and all the, Paul Klee and all the modern painters, Schoenberg and Stravinsky, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and so forth. That's modernity. But in larger circles, academic circles, modernity is like either beginning at 1600 or 1700. The understanding is that either it involves the work of the scientific revolution that makes the modern world possible, or those who, like 1700, talk about the development of what we call the public sphere. That is, so that there was a level of literacy in the West that was such that, people could write pamphlets and distribute pamphlets and newspapers and so forth. It's the age of print. And This is the modernity that this book is about. Where my part 3 comes in is this, that we were talking about freedom and freedom and freedom in all sorts of philosophical and theological terms. And I said, you know, if we're talking about freedom 1740 to 1850, the whole economy of the West was built on slavery during those years. And why not talk about something that was really important on the ground, namely slavery? So this was accepted as an idea. And so part 1, the hero composers are Beethoven, Haydn, basically those two. Part 2, Bach and Mendelssohn. Part 4, less on composers than philosophers and literary folks. But part 3, they liked the idea of talking about freedom during this period, but who was an important figure that we could talk about for those dates? Well, there were two African-American women, 2 young African-American women who were at the latter stages of their doctoral dissertations, Therese Barron and Awet Andemichael. Both of them were very, very smart, very, very interesting, and both of them said, how about Richard Allen? I'd never heard of Richard Allen. It turns out, as you now know, he was the founder of the AME Church and was an extremely important person around the turn of the 19th century. His dates were 1760 to 1831. He was born slave, and he eventually established this church, which is on a property that he himself bought in the 1790s. This is the oldest, it's the piece of property owned continuously by blacks in the country, ever, right? And it's still there. Sharice and I went to visit the church in the summer of 2019 and met some people and saw it. It's a very historical place. They have a historical museum. Richard Allen, it turns out, he's a big deal in Philadelphia. People know who this guy is. There's a museum of black history in Philadelphia, and there's a big mural, and he's like the second person on this mural, eventually getting to people that are more current and that you know. So anyway, Bethel Church is a big deal. It's very, very, very interesting. We here don't know much about it, but there are folks who know a lot about it. And so what I'm going to do first is this, and you will think this is a bizarre thing for a guy to do, but I'm going to show you a DVD. Why? Because this is produced by Bethel Church. It's their introduction to the history of the church and the life of Richard Allen. It's not a documentary. It's like an acting out of this person and what he did. This is not the way I taught at Yale for 23 years. I didn't just bring a class in and say, okay, we're going to watch a film today. This is a nice strategy for teaching, but it's not one that you can use very often. But even though it's not me talking, I wanted you to get it sort of from the source. So I think that this will be a worthwhile thing to do. Again, ancient technology, so let's hope it works.
Whoever hopes for the great things in this world takes pains to attain them. How can my hopes of everlasting life be well grounded if I do not strive and labor for that eternal inheritance? Breathe forth love to thee, my God. We were stolen from our mother country and brought here. We have tilled the ground and made fortunes for thousands, and still they're not weary of our services. I was born in 1760, on February 14th, a slave to Benjamin Chew of Philadelphia.
Richard Allen, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, was the founder and first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And he was sold at the age of 7 years to a Stokely Sturgis in Delaware.
Slavery is a bitter pill. We would think that our day's work was never done. And thus my troubles were increased, and I was often brought to weep.
The rest of the family was sold off, and there was never any contact made with the major part of his family again.
My sins were a heavy burden. I thought hell would be my portion. I cried unto him, and all of a sudden my dungeon shook. My chains flew off. And glory to God, I cried. I was constrained to go from house to house, exhorting my old companions and telling to all what a dear Savior I had found. I joined the Methodist Society and met in class in the forest.
The relationship in Delaware, in the forest and on the plantation, was really inclusive of all people. There was a welcoming sense of inclusion that allowed both blacks and whites together to experience the religion and the interaction.
One of the great things about reading about the story, the life and times of Richard Allen, was that all people were equal under the eyes of God.
Methodism had a well-deserved reputation for being open to all people, regardless of color, class, or rank. And this kind of egalitarian attitude drew Allen and others to the Methodist sect.
So when Allen met them, it was not uncommon to find a black slave, for example, preaching to white slave owners.
Richard Allen has this epiphany when he sees traveling preachers. He says, oh my God, the Word of God will let me imagine another world where masters aren't in control of black people's lives and bodies. In addition to working long days, he starts to dedicate long evenings and early mornings to Bible worship. And this is his first foot out the door of slavery.
It had often impressed upon my mind that I should one day enjoy my freedom. A door was opened unexpectedly for me to buy my time. My master proposed to me and my brother to buy our freedom. $2,000 continental money. I came to Philadelphia. Preaching was given out to me at 5 o'clock in the morning at St. George's Church.
The Methodist movement in America was growing.
The largest population of blacks in America at that time is here in Philadelphia. The numbers of blacks coming into St. George's Church were increasing by leaps and bounds.
As Methodism became far more institutional, it seemed that it became less and less racially egalitarian. So it is at this moment that Richard Allen begins to ponder the creation of an African church.
Absalom Jones and I discussed feeling cramped. So we saw the necessity of erecting a place of worship for the colored people. We raised a society of 42 members.
A free African society. Most people probably thought he was out of his mind. I mean, free. I mean, where would you go?
The Methodist establishment was threatened by Allen's actions.
The elders soon forbid us holding any such meetings. He used very degrading and insulting language to us.
So, tensions are building when Richard Allen and Absalom Jones show up to church on a Sunday like they ordinarily would, but the rules have changed all of a sudden.
Jones and Allen arrived that Sunday morning and were directed to the balcony. They felt that they were co-owners of this church. They were not going to sit in an all-black section.
We had not been long upon our knees before I saw one of the trustees having hold of Reverend Absalom Jones, pulling him up off his knees.
The usher persisted and began to forcibly move Absalom Jones.
Mr. Jones said, "Wait until prayer is over, and I will get up and trouble you no more." By this time, prayer was over, and we all went out of the church in a body, and they were no more plagued with us in church.
So something very hostile, something very mean-spirited, something very awful happened that day.
The walkout was the beginning of the civil rights movement in the United States of America.
The black church gave Richard Allen a sense of freedom and autonomy impossible to imagine.
We had no place of worship, and we did not mean to go to St. George's Church anymore. Here was the beginning and rise of the first African church in America.
In the summer of 1793, yellow fever broke out all over Philadelphia. The mayor of Philadelphia asked Absalom Jones and Richard Allen to help take care of the sick and the dead.
Benjamin Rush, who was the leading physician in Philadelphia, wrongly concluded that people of African descent were immune from the effects of the yellow fever and thought that they could help their cause for equality and the creation of an inclusive society by going into the homes of white, suffering Philadelphians and nursing those who were sick and burying those who had died.
And so we did. Our moral certitude would be on trial, and we would prove ourselves the equal. No, the superior, all our vilifiers.
They had carts and they were hauling bodies up and down the street, and they were calling, "Bring out your dead." There was just so much devastation and illness around the city, and people just didn't know why everyone was dying.
Matthew Carey, who was a local publisher, published an account wherein, as part of his story, he accused the nurses of having charged exorbitant rates and also of stealing from some of their patients.
Instead of doing what most people would have done, which is simply just shrug their shoulders and say, what can we do? They did what was unheard of. They sat down and they wrote their own account.
he was wrong in giving so partial and injurious an account of the colored nurses. If they have taken advantage of the public distress, is it any more than Mr. Carey hath done of its desire for information?
This was the first copyrighted pamphlet published by Africans in America.
While others allowed that Matthew Carey could write a one-sided story, Richard Allen understood that if you did not write down your version, then it didn't happen.
Is it a greater crime for a black to pilfer than for a white to privateer? Such slanderers as these who propagate such willful lies are dangerous.
The striking quality about Allen is that he has an indomitable will and really thinks that he can do anything in life.
But the white Methodists forced Allen's hand. They claimed Bethel Church as their own. They aimed to take over the church and install a white elder.
Allen won't budge. He leads a resistance, and the congregation backs him willingly.
A new clergyman was appointed to take the charge in Philadelphia. He soon waked us up by demanding the keys and the books. Unless we submitted to him, he would read us all out of meeting. We told him the house was ours, we had bought it, and paid for it. This brought on a lawsuit, which ended in our favor, delivered by the providence of God and determined by the Supreme Court.
The very first sit-in in America was not in the 1950s at a lunch counter, but the first sit-in was actually at Mother Bethel Church.
This led directly to the formation of the AME Church, and it became an unprecedented assertion of black self-determination. From Bethel, the church would grow and grow rapidly. The AME Church came to be, as W.E.B. Du Bois described, the greatest Negro organization in the world.
Women were always there. Women were with Allen and Jones as they walked out of St. George Methodist Episcopal Church.
This was certainly the case for his first wife, Flora, who helped form the Free African Society. When Flora died, Allen married Sarah Bass, who had distinguished herself as a nurse during the yellow fever epidemic. They had 6 children together. Sarah became very involved in helping Allen build the church. She became the quintessential mother and a role model for other African women.
Preaching under the auspices of Bethel and other AME churches was the job of men. Women didn't lead.
Dorena Lee was a young mother in Allen's congregation. She was sanctified, and inspired by Allen, she felt the calling to preach.
There was a lot of opposition to women speaking in Allen's church.
Richard Allen said that the Methodist discipline knew nothing about women preachers. So Allen is deliberately ambiguous. He never said no. He meant no, but he didn't want the record to reflect no.
While there was involvement of women in the life of the church, there was no involvement at the level of ministry and ordination and preaching.
Then one day, as a minister at Bethel is preaching, he loses his place.
It was at that point that Dorena Lee, feeling the Spirit, preached that text with fervor. And it was in that particular moment of the Spirit that Richard Allen recognize and acknowledge that indeed Dorina Lee was called of God to preach. But she continued to receive resistance from some of her brothers. But it did not stop her. Oh, how careful ought we be, lest we call into disrepute even the word of life, she warned.
Despite many successes, especially in creating an independent black church, Richard Allen confronted many frustrations and disappointments, and he was mad and angry with American society, and he was afraid that many of his hopes, dreams, and aspirations would not be realized.
It's not surprising, after all that Allen had gone through in his later years, that he would begin to have doubts about whether or not America could be a place and a home for blacks.
Richard Allen and his colleagues began to explore options for a free black colony, either in Haiti or in Africa or perhaps even in Canada. They were serious, but at the same time, a group of whites formed the American Colonization Society. From the outset, the American Colonization Society was a front to send all free blacks out of American society. They never intended to send slaves to Africa. Richard Allen still believed that the idea of some African Americans immigrating outside of the United States was worthy of discussion.
There was a meeting held at Mother Bethel in 1817 where the leadership in the black community called together a mass meeting of black Philadelphians to discuss colonization.
When all of the discussion had ended and the meeting was coming to its conclusion, it was clear that the movement was not going to find favor.
Richard Allen was an intelligent man. He was a fearless man. Everything that he did was helping us prepare for the future.
By the end of his life, through the ups and through the downs, Allen became really committed to staying in America and making things work. And it's amazing because when he died in 1831, there really weren't many signs that were hopeful that things would ever get better for the majority of blacks in America. And yet, he died at peace, that this was home.
This land which we have watered with our tears and our blood is now our mother country. And we are well satisfied to stay. Here, wisdom abounds, and the gospel is free.
So you can see why I wanted you to see that rather than telling you myself, because it came from, it came from the source. And I think it was really, really lovely. Okay, so I know that took a lot of time, but that really gives you the spirit of what this person was about. A few things to say about him. I mean, he was very, very, very smart, and he was also very, very, very determined. So when he was, so we think he was born in Philadelphia, but we're not sure. He might have been born in Delaware because his master, Benjamin Chew, who was a very important person, he eventually became the Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court a couple of decades later. He had properties in Delaware, and so when at some point Richard Allen and his family were moved to a farm in Delaware. what happened to them happened to so many families. That is, that the family was then sold to a farmer who was a less prosperous farmer, who could not really support them. So his name was Stokely Sturgis, and he sold half of the family to somebody else. So the mom and the 3 younger kids disappeared, and Alan and his 3 older siblings stayed with Stokely Sturgis. So this was the kind of thing that happened back then. But Stokely Sturgis turned out to be despite the fact that he was a slaveholder, he was not a bad guy. He eventually saw that slavery was wrong because, itinerant preachers came in, as it said in the video. Itinerant preachers came in. The black people would go out into the woods and have worship services and listen to the preacher. And it was under these conditions that Alan had his conversion experience, which at that time, in the first and second Great Awakenings in this country, that was what happened, and it was blacks and whites together, as they said. So in 1777, he had this wonderful experience, and he eventually convinced Stokely Sturgis to let preachers come in to his house and have worship services there. And when they did, he began to see that slavery was wrong himself. And so he told his, Richard Allen, his brother, make $2,000 in 5 years and you will buy your freedom. And so, typical of Richard Allen, he went out, the way he made his money was chopping wood. And so he was a sawyer, sort of like Abraham Lincoln. He would work incredible hours for weeks and years, months and years. And so he made his $2,000 in 3.5 years rather than 5. And sure enough, he came to Stokely Sturgis and said, okay, here's the money. And so Stokely Sturgis gave him his freedom. There's this wonderful document in which he says, I released Richard Allen, I released Negro Richard. He was called Negro Richard for, in this formal language. It's in a book somewhere. I was going to read it, but I don't want to take time to do that. But in any case, so Allen starts his own preaching and eventually ends up in Philadelphia, where, as you see, if you look at your first handout, the bio. I was going to go through this in some detail, but that would take a very, very, very long time. You can identify some of the things that happened through the video, and there's a lot more detail here, which I hope I've given enough detail. But the guy was really, really, really interesting. He taught himself to read. He taught himself to preach. He went to Philadelphia. He became a citizen of Philadelphia in supporting the black people, starting a black church. He was indomitable. I want to, look at the flip side of this. I talked about, quote, the public sphere. One of the things that was really important about Richard Allen was that he established a public persona in Philadelphia through his church, but also just through who he was. I've listed his publications on the back side. So first thing, in 1794, the year after the yellow fever epidemic, there was an accusation that the black people, Benjamin Rush, the doctor, thought that the blacks were immune to yellow fever, which was dead wrong. So, but the black people under Allen and Absalom Jones, went and helped people, brought dead bodies out, did what medical treatment they could with the people, and then their reward was that, a lot of the white people said, they were stealing, they were not doing their jobs, they were lazy, whatever. And so AJ and RA, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, wrote this rejoinder, which was his first publication. Then addressed to those who keep slaves and approve the practice, you know what that's about, to some people of color. These were publications that people read, they were posted, Eventually he wrote an autobiography in 1833. 1799, he wrote a eulogy to George Washington. There's a lot of stuff there. here's what we're going to do. So I would like for you to read the chapter that I wrote. I didn't want you to be introduced to Richard Allen through that chapter, but rather to be introduced through this video in the words of Mother Bethel. But we're making a copy of the chapter. If you will, if you will just let me know that you were here, I'll have you sign a paper, and I will email you through the church directory. I'll email you a copy of the chapter so that you can read it and then bring it back, or bring it with you next week, and we'll talk about it and we'll go further. But I think we should spend some time talking about music, okay? So, yeah, we'll have 15 or 20 minutes to talk about music. So this is what the other two handouts are about. You can look over my outline of the biography. You'll get more context when you read the chapter. If you want to learn a little bit more, first, don't look at the Wikipedia article. The Wikipedia article is, I love Wikipedia. I'm a devotee of Wikipedia, but this article is not good. It misstates some things. It will be more confusing to you than enlightening. So read my chapter. Read his autobiography. There's, if you put the title, The Life Experience and Gospel Labors of the Right Reverend Richard Allen, University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill has the whole thing and all of his publications in a single website. So if you want to read the guy himself, you can do it. Just Google this title and you'll find it. Okay, the next two, the other two handouts. Look at this one first. I want to correct an impression that I might have given you, which is that perhaps Richard Allen was a musician and a composer or whatever. That is absolutely not the case. He was not a musician. Where he fits into the history of black music is this, that in Mother Bethel Church, once it got established in 1796, where was it? 1794. Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church was dedicated July 19th, 1794. Okay, so by 1801, the church had grown. He needed hymnals. So in 1801, he published one hymnal early in the year, another hymnal later in the year. And what you have here is the second of those hymnals, the one that was published probably in November or so of that year. This is from a source called hymnary.org. You can find the contents of virtually any hymnal that's ever been published in hymnary.org. I printed it out. I noticed that it wouldn't print the last three titles on each page, so I just wrote with my hand the last three. So it all adds up to 64. It's two-sided, right? So you can read the whole thing. Few interesting things about this. One of them is when we think of a hymnal, we think of, the hymns, the text, the music, whatever. There was no music in this hymnal, or in these hymnals, or any hymnal that he ever published. The first AME hymnal that actually had notes in it wasn't published till 1898. And so, why is that? Well, there were lots of hymnals that were published without music. Jerry Anderson gave me a couple of hymnals years ago that were, 75 to 100 years old or more. No music at all. So that we're ignorant in many, many ways. Most of these hymns, we don't know what tune they were sung to. If you look at the third handout, this one. So you see the title, A Collection of Hymns and Spiritual Songs from Various Authors. Okay, so the first hymnal, if you look at the Roman numerals, the first hymnal was the first 54 of those. Then the one later in 1801 just added the last 10. So it's text only. And so if I print in caps the name of a tune, there are only, I think, 7 of those 64 hymns that we know what tune they were sung to. Otherwise, it's anybody's guess. You know, people who have worked on this for years still have no idea. I want you to look at the list of hymns, scan the whole thing, which you can do very quickly, and tell me how many of those hymns you recognize, how many of those texts do you recognize? I know it takes time to count that high. Do you see any of these recognized? Yeah, okay, there are. I've done church music for a very long time, and I recognize 2 out of 64. As Arthur says, Jerusalem, my happy home, definitely. And the other one is, Am I a Soldier of the Cross? Which, growing up a Methodist, I knew that one as well. But the other 62, I've never heard of. And so where do they come from? Well, they come from, there's an interesting combination of British Protestant culture and African musical traditions. And so they're, what are called spiritual songs are probably in some sense out of an African tradition, probably in the services that were held at night in the forest, right? The kinds of texts there are, if you know the kind of post-heavy-duty Puritan spirituality in this country, the kinds of titles you have here, the kinds of texts and so forth, they're all of a piece, right? Some of them come probably from revival songs in the country. Others are from texts and possibly tunes that were used in British and then American churches. So the other thing I've done in this last handout is, if the author of the text is known, I give it. But if it's not known, I just put 3 question marks. And so an interesting study is, you can see that there aren't that many of which we know even the author, not to mention the tune. And what names do you recognize of the authors? Isaac Watts, for sure. Who? John Newton, and maybe one more. Charles Wesley, right. Okay, so the reason, pardon? And Thomas Arndt, who wrote not a text, but he was actually the composer of one of the tunes. So the music I played this morning was topical for what we're doing now. Because, the postlude was a Charles Wesley piece, the prelude was a Charles Wesley piece, the offertory was a tune by Thomas Arndt, and the postlude was by a British composer named Samuel Long, who doesn't really have anything to do with this. But I mean, that gives you kind of a sense of some of the music. But in any case, it's just very, very interesting how little we know and what happens to be the stuff that we do know. There's an interesting aspect of the title, that this is the second hymnal of 1801. Why he did 2 in the same year is a little bit iffy, I don't know, mysterious. But a cool thing about it is that the first hymnal that was published earlier in the year was called A Collection of Spiritual Songs and Hymns. The second one is called A Collection of Hymns and Spiritual Songs, which tells you just a little bit about, there was a little bit of a turn toward more formality, right? Because the hymns are more formal, more like written out than the spiritual songs. Remember that probably 3/4 of this congregation was illiterate. And so what many of them did, they had to do it by ear. One of the practices was called lining out, where a musician would sing a line, the congregation would sing the line back, and they would go back and forth. No organ, no instruments, no anything, just singing. there's a wonderful, I say DVD, a wonderful recording by Willie Ruff, who was a jazz person at Yale, who was interested in this tradition. And he actually made a recording, which I can show you a bit of, if you like, next week, whereby there's the tradition of lining out a church in Alabama and a church in Scotland, I think. He brought all of these folks together, and they sang in lining out. You think, wow, that's really, really interesting. Well, what you find out is that it's not, it ain't beautiful, right? The caller sings out the line, and the response is very, very slow and kind of not very energetic, you know. They go, line 1, line 2. But that was the practice, you know. So it's interesting. That sort of covers things. There's a lot of detail that I could add, but I don't want to go on too long. So any comments, questions before we hang it up? Yeah. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. He's not. I mean, there was no sense in which he was a musician at all. There's this wonderful biography, which is called Freedom's Prophet, Bishop Richard Allen, the AME Church, and the Black Founding Fathers. This is a wonderful book by Richard Newman, who made a couple of appearances in the film, right? He's a really, really good scholar. Interestingly, I mean, his historian, where does he teach? He teaches at the Rochester Institute of Technology, not where you would expect to find somebody who writes a book like this. But it's a really, really, really good book. And, you know, virtually everything I say about the biography is from this book. I have to read you one quick line. This is from Frederick Douglass in a speech he gave in 1894, the year before Frederick Douglass died. He says, in 1893. He gave this speech at the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, and he says, among the remarkable men whose names have found deserved place in American annals, there is not one who will be longer remembered or whose memory will be more sacredly cherished by coming generations of colored Americans than will the name and character of Richard Allen. There is therefore reason to believe that were Richard Allen alive today, surrounded by the improved conditions which now surround the colored people in this country, he would be the leader of his people now precisely as he was in the days of his generation. So, high words to, in honor of somebody who was really important. Allen was like 2 generations before Frederick Douglass. Allen was born in 1760. Douglass was born in 1818. But Douglass built on a lot of the work that Richard Allen did. So, okay, other questions? Yeah, yeah.
You said you visited the church, so in the video that we saw, the beautiful sanctuary, is that the one that?
Yeah, yeah, the church is still there. One incredible story is that he bought the land. And he was very, 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 he was a good pastor. He was a hard worker. No, okay, that's right. He was a good capitalist. He was a hard worker, as you know, because he bought himself out of slavery. But when he moved to Philadelphia, he preached at St. George's Methodist Church, but they would only let him preach at 5 a.m. So he had to make a living. So he did various jobs. You know, he sold dry goods, he chopped wood, he painted fences. The big one was that he was a chimney sweep. And eventually, he made his own, even while he was a pastor, he made his own chimney sweep business. And his chimney sweep business did George Washington's house in Philadelphia. You have to remember in the 1790s, the capital of the country was Philadelphia, right? And so it's not impossible that, and this biography talks about it, that when he went to collect money, that he either saw or even met George Washington. And George Washington, at the end of his life, in his will, he freed all of his slaves, and that's why Richard Allen did a eulogy to George Washington in 1799 because he, would that all slaveholders would do this as well. The other eulogy to a man named Warner Mifflin. Mifflin was a rich white guy in Maryland who did the same thing and released dozens and dozens of slaves. So, yeah, so the church is still there. When Allen bought this property in like 1791, and then when it was time to build the church, what did he do? He took an old blacksmith shop and put it on a gigantic cart and carried the thing to this property, and that was the first church. And then it was, that was torn down, and it got bigger and so forth. It's a beautiful church. It's absolutely worth visiting. Yeah, a very sad thing. I mean, there's, Frederick Douglass talks about how much better things were in 1893 than, 100 years before that, which they were, but they really weren't, and they still aren't. And so something that happened in February of this year was that somebody vandalized the church and broke a bunch of those windows. And it's such a valued place in Philadelphia that lots of people gave thousands of dollars to rebuild the windows. So for all of his work, the fact is there's still racism out there. Yeah, Ralph?
About the factor of music in the hymns,
Mm-hmm.
I can think of two reasons. One is even with computer technology, it's hard to set those lines.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm guessing that there was an African influence, and the syncopations and off rhythms are extremely difficult to notate in Western notation. Is that a factor?
That's a factor, yeah. In fact, I talk about that a little bit in the article. So it is, we've been going on about an hour, right? Okay, so I think it's time to break. Obviously, I could talk for another hour, but I'm not going to. So before you leave, where's a clean sheet of paper?
I took a photo of everyone here.
Oh, okay.
So
And we,
maybe what we'll do is we're going to scan the article, we can email it out to folks, and then we might be able to just put a link to it in the Thursday email as well. So if for any reason you don't get it emailed to you by like Wednesday, then look for it in the Thursday email, and then everyone will have access to the chat.
okay, right, okay.
And then we'll
Yeah.
continue the discussion.
Yeah, okay, and so we'll talk about a little bit more biography next week, and we'll also get a little bit more into the music. And what I want to do, because it's extremely interesting, and this I talk about in the latter part of the article, what is the relationship between these two hymnals and the spiritual? I mean, that's what I was really interested in finding out. And it's not an easy question, but it's a hyper interesting question. And I think that I have a lot to tell you that you will learn, and it will be news to you about the spiritual next week and its relationship to this stuff. So anyway, thanks for coming. And, yeah.